Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Struggle Well Read Along. Thank you for joining me. And for those of you who are watching after the fact, thank you for watching the recording. I really appreciate your spending time with me and digging into this really great book, Struggle Well, to learn how to struggle well. I think this chapter 3 is got a lot, a lot of gems. It was um, not a necessarily difficult read for me, but it was a bit challenging to really contemplate and to reflect on because there's a lot of good bits in it. And I apologize again for last week not working very well. Facebook had its issues, I guess, and I had trouble with Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook, and I just could not get online. So I apologize for that. And but anyways, we're here to make up for it this week, as I said with chapter 3. So I hope that you will be asking any questions you have, letting me know that you're here, making any comments at any time, and I will promise that I will keep an eye on that this time, as opposed to maybe missing out like I did that one other week when I didn't even notice comments were popping up. So as I said, chapter 3 was really good for me. The title of the chapter is Look Back to Move Forward. And they use the analogy of driving in a car again with this chapter, which I really appreciated. In terms of your car, you're driving down the road, you're going forward. And so you might look in the rear view mirror, but if you stay looking in the rear view mirror, you are not going to do very well driving forward. But there are times when you need to look at what's behind you when you're driving to see that someone might not be coming up too close behind you, or other sort of things like that. And so it was a really interesting metaphor in this chapter to kind of help me see how we do need to dig into what's in the past, and the way that this chapter gives you a way to look at it is not easy, but I think very necessary. So the first thing that I highlighted is the sentence, "It's not what's wrong, it's what happened." That's such an interesting thing to think about with trauma. It's not necessarily that it's wrong, or that you're wrong, or that something was necessarily, let's say, wrong, as opposed to thinking about it, something just happened. And this is something that the book has said a couple of times already, and that I actually talked about today in a workshop, where we will always have struggle. Problems and struggle will always come. And so it's that what happened that we need to kind of deal with and dig into and see how it's affected us, not necessarily looking at the wrong. So I did like that. And the next thing that I highlighted is, you are not who you think you are. You are who you have been trained to be in terms of your beliefs and your behaviors. This is a concept, or it's been stated here in the book in a way that I had never thought of it before, where you, based on your upbringing and the way your parents raised you and the environment you were in, maybe other relatives, you were trained to be a certain way, and your beliefs came from that, and your behaviors came from that. And so that's not who you are, it's just who you were trained to be, which means, as they say in chapter 3, you can train yourself to be who you want to be and who you should be, as opposed to just kind of giving up and saying, well, this is the way I am because this is what I grew up with, and this is my mom and my dad did this to me or whatever, and so I'm this way, and I can't change. And that's not true. We can train or retrain ourselves to be better, to improve, to struggle well, and to become the person and the people that we want to be. And so another thing that I really liked in this chapter was that we can work, we can retrain ourselves in such a way that we can stop the trauma from continuing on into the next generation. And I thought that was a really interesting. I don't have children, but I can see that this really hits home for people who do. But it still makes me think, like, I don't want to pass this on to other people, and I don't want to keep living with negative effects of trauma either. And so this made me think of an exercise I did with my therapist in Toronto years ago. She called it a traumagram, and it was basically looks like a family tree that you would do with your ancestry or something like that. But instead of putting in, details about who married who, and family, quote unquote, details, you would put in instances of trauma or experiences that these people had, that you knew of, that you witnessed, that happened to you, and basically kind of make a family tree chart of the trauma that came before you. And that was a real eye-opening thing for me, because we find it sometimes, I think, difficult to forgive people who have maybe mistreated us or not given us the support we thought we should have. And so doing this kind of thing, and like thinking about the generational passing on of trauma, makes you think that sometimes we need to realize that just like us, other people were doing the best that they could with the tools that they had at the time. And so to be just cognizant of that, to be aware of that. It also makes me think, though, and it's a little disappointing, unfortunately, to kind of think about it this way too, where some societies or cultures or groups of people who have had trauma through the generations will have a lot of work to do and lots of focus, or struggle to be able to break that ongoing link to trauma that they pass on from generation to generation. So that's something to think about too. Another thing that I liked is that they said the traumatic experiences that occurred during childhood make a deeper and longer lasting impact than experiences which happen later in life. And this is one of the reasons it says in this chapter, we're looking back to move forward, because those things that happen when we are really learning about the world, when we are growing, when we are responding to things in certain ways, when we are curious and we are exploring and discovering, when we are a child, traumatic experiences in that scenario make a deeper and longer lasting impact, because we are putting our trust on a lot of people. We're kids. We don't know how to do everything that we need to do. And so I can say that that is very true for my life, and that the childhood trauma that I experienced has had deep and long lasting impact on me in negative and difficult and unfortunate ways that I still struggle with. I still try to not let the triggers overwhelm me, or the emotions, to pause and reflect more often so that I don't kind of go off in directions that are not helpful. And so it was good to see in this chapter that we do need to look back and see how these things have molded us and have trained us to be a certain way, before we can then see, okay, how can I retrain myself now to be able to go forward and make an improvement. So again, another thing that I liked here is struggle tends to cause people to revert back to whatever they were exposed to as normal while growing up. So that's another interesting thing, right? Is that in your family, you don't necessarily know anything else outside your house when you're a kid. So you think that what you experience is normal. So if that means alcoholism or neglect, mistreatment, abuse, these things seem to be normal to you because you don't really know any better, and you're not about to go and tell your friends and neighbors like, oh, is this happening at your house too? And so you just think that it's a normal, and that can obviously have impacts on you going forward, where you are then feeling a little uncomfortable, and it's difficult for you to go in spaces where they are different than what you grew up with, because that doesn't feel normal, even if it's healthy and better. And so that's just something interesting I thought to look at too. One thing I also highlighted here about the training and the retraining, in terms of we're trained to be a certain way, but we can retrain ourselves to be something different and improve, is here, this one paragraph. If you take a good hard look at the parts of yourself that you wish to change, you'll likely find that the barriers to improvement are related to how you were trained as a child. Similarly, the areas where you excel also tie back to your training. Your childhood experiences, therefore, are predictors of your current struggle and behaviors. So again, all this stuff comes forward. It comes forward into your life. It comes forward into adulthood, and we can't just ignore it and say, that that's unimportant, or that we bury it, or keep it, down. We do need to face this stuff. We need to look back to go forward and figure out how we can retrain our brains, our heart, our approach, to be able to live the way that we want to live and struggle well. So I did like that as well. The next thing that I highlighted is about Well, I'll just read it and then I'll expand a bit. Here's where this gets really important. Your struggles rarely impact just you. It's not just your own goals that may be impeded by your past struggles. As the saying goes, hurt people hurt people. If you don't take the time to closely examine your own pain, you not only obstruct your own success, you are at risk of doing to others the painful things that were done to you. I know from experience, this has been my situation, that when I was really hurting in the past, I was hurting other people. I know this for sure. I know that some of my goals were impeded because of this from my past struggles. And it's so interesting to read this again. And don't think I'd ever heard this expression necessarily before, where hurt people hurt people. Very, very true. And so this is another thing that's tied into the passing trauma onto future generations and just to others. That if you are not dealing with your hurt, if you're not, um, digging in and figuring out what you need to do to kind of get past the struggles, then you are definitely going to be hurting other people and impeding their growth as well, and maybe doing painful things to them as well. And I'm sure none of us want to do that. So important to dig in and figure out what's going on there. So another thing that I've highlighted here is somebody's own struggle does manifest itself in the way they treat you, but that's not a statement on your character or your value. It's a statement on someone else's struggles. So this is a very interesting too, and it's a piece to think about. In this chapter, both authors were talking about their childhood and what they grew up with and some of the struggles of their parents and other relatives. And so it's interesting here to see that as a children, when we were not treated or supported properly because our parents were struggling, that didn't mean that our value had changed or our character. It wasn't a statement on our character or value. But as children, we don't know that, right? And so as it says here, it's a statement on someone else's struggles. They are struggling, and so they are reacting and behaving in such a way that we receive, unfortunately, negative treatment or whatever. And so this is something to think of for ourselves as well, though, right? That if we are getting mistreated by others or we are treating others improperly, it's a statement on our own struggles if we are doing it to someone else. But if someone's doing it to us, we shouldn't let that affect our value and our sense of character and our confidence, and recognize and then have a little more patience and empathy with people too, that they're struggling as well. And when we're struggling, we're not perfect and we're going to make mistakes and we are going to possibly hurt others. And so why would we expect any different from other people as well? That doesn't mean that we forgive mistreatment or someone disrespecting us, but I think there's a piece of empathy that enters into that picture that we should be aware of. Now, one thing that I found was a little difficult to kind of wrap my head around, or to accept, maybe is a better word. This was talking about Ken, one of the authors. If you take a good hard look at some of the most formative experiences, you'll usually find both gifts and pain, both good and bad. In identifying those nuanced layers, you'll often find reasons to feel compassion for the people in your life that you most want to blame. So like I said, a bit of empathy comes in here, because when we're struggling, when it's hard, when we are not sure what to do, when emotions are first coming up in our brain and we're not necessarily thinking and pausing and responding as opposed to reacting, we really want to blame other people for the struggles that we have, for the difficulties, for the trouble we had as children, for the trauma that happened to us. I know that I've definitely felt that way many times about the childhood trauma that I suffered. I'm like, why wasn't I protected? Why were my parents not aware? Why were they not protecting me? Why did they not stop what happened to me? And I want to blame them, right? But it's just so interesting to look at this and think about more compassion, that my parents were struggling. They were obviously not surviving well or struggling well themselves. And so if I put myself in their shoes and have a little bit of empathy, then I have a bit more nuance to it, as it says here. I understand a little bit more. And so, and in that way, you also then have to think about what gifts did you get from them. There's not all bad. And that's been difficult for me to think about what might have been the gifts or the good things. And so it's an exercise I would actually like to sit down and kind of consider a bit more when I do some journaling, is think about what are some of the gifts that got passed on to me, because I've for many years, because the struggle has been so difficult, I've more focused on blame and not so much thinking about the good things that came my way, which is something I would like to change, because you don't want to look back in the past and just see all bad, right? And so that's an excellent thing to consider. And then another sentence here: it's easy to forget that the people who caused you pain might have been in pain themselves. And so that would definitely probably be true. And again, I'm not saying that you forgive if someone has mistreated you or abused you or something like that, but maybe it just helps a little bit more in terms of the acceptance of the situation, and that struggle is part of life and it happened. And so what do I do now based on this knowledge, and how can I make things better for myself, as opposed to feeling sorry for myself or always feeling down. Another thing that I really liked here is, this is an interesting one here. I'm going to read this as well. A life that would otherwise remain balanced and a person who would otherwise remain secure can be thrown completely off course by the triggering of an unprocessed childhood event. So I know for sure that that has happened to me before, where I have had something that has been in the past that I have not dealt with, that I have not processed, and something will happen in a relationship or out at work or out in the world that will trigger something in me that will really send me down a bad path, because I have not processed that thing. And so that's an interesting thing that I'm doing now with my therapist, is that sometimes when I go there, I will just say to her, you know, in the last week or the last 2 weeks, there was this event that on the surface or whatever didn't seem too abnormal or crazy, but my reaction was like really overblown and beyond what I would have normally expected, and there was a lot more emotion involved than I had expected. And so when that happens to me, then I kind of go, there's something going on there in the background that I need to kind of process and dig into. And sure enough, I can usually tie it back to some childhood event that makes sense as to why that triggered a feeling in me and a memory and a certain emotion that didn't serve me well. So I really appreciated that kind of call out in the book about that reality. It's something that I am trying to work on. Unfortunately, there's quite a few childhood events sometimes that we have to process, but you know, better to process than not, and better to be dealing with these triggers in a better, proper, calm way than to have yourself always kind of your emotions high and outside that kind of wave that Ken and Josh talk about. So better to dig in and process than to go to extremes all the time, because that can be so exhausting. Another thing that I liked here is, it's not that you get angry at traffic. What bothers you is constantly having your momentum stopped. So that's an interesting thing to think about with their driving metaphor, that sometimes you just get really frustrated because you want to move forward and you want your momentum to go and you want to grow and you want to do things, but you just weren't able. You feel stuck, and that can often be really frustrating for people who felt stuck a lot when they were kids, because their parents, maybe their father who was an alcoholic or something else, stopped them from doing what they wanted to do. So I have a friend in this kind of situation where parents were very strict when he was growing up, and there were so many things that he wanted to do, that he loved to do, that he was curious about, that he wanted to discover, that he just could not. And so he often now will feel that kind of stuck, trapped feeling in certain situations where he wants to go forward or he wants to do something and he just can't. And the emotions are a lot more pronounced than you would expect for the situation, but it's because it harkens back for him that feeling of being, you know, trapped and held back as a child. So it's incredible how these things from when we were children years and years ago can really carry forward into the future. Another thing I liked here is, our past experiences can cloud our capacity to see how to respond in the situation. So that's a very interesting thing too. Like, we have talked about this before, as about responding versus reacting. And so here, sometimes these feelings that crop up and they kind of emotions first, as I like to say, in your brain can prevent you from responding properly in the situation, can kind of cloud your judgment, cloud your vision on what the reality really is, and prevent you from really responding properly. And like I said, it can be tiring, excuse me, and it can be frustrating for other people as well. And that's the other thing that I like to pay attention to. So there's quite a bit more here that I've highlighted. I'm going to grab a couple more because I don't want to keep you too long. One thing that I liked here, and there's a quote from Carl Jung: "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That's an incredible quote. So I'll just read that again. "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." So again, so important to dig into those unconscious things that are just below the surface and that will pop up and trigger based on certain events that harken back to childhood experiences. Because otherwise, if we're not digging in, we're just going to say, oh, this is fate, oh, and I can't do anything about this, and oh, this is just the way it is for me. And it's not. Like, we can change things. We can retrain ourselves and we can make things better. So until we dig in, though, and make the unconscious conscious, not going to make much forward progress. This quote, I really, really, really like this. So, disclosure is what starts to open up that space needed between how you behave currently and who you want to be. When you're holding onto something that hasn't been disclosed, it's hard to get over it. You may have identified the source of your struggle, but without naming that out loud in the company of empathetic listeners, it remains stuck inside you. This is so true. I've seen this happen when I was a co-facilitator for a men's group for men who had been abused as children, sexually abused as children. I saw when men came for like their first time, or when they disclosed to the group for the first time their story, what a difference it makes. When you have a group of people, like it says here, empathetic listeners, it's such a big step. It really, really starts something to change in you. It really gives you space, like it says here, to then recognize and see who you want to be and what you want to be. So I really like that they talk so important, they highlight so importantly this the importance step of disclosure, of telling your story to someone else or a company of people who will listen and be empathetic. What a difference it makes. And I know, and I'm sure that anybody watching knows as well who has done this, that once you kind of get it out of you, what a difference it makes. It feels like you've released something from your life. You've gotten rid of a big boulder or a rock from your shoulders, and you can go forward in a different way, for sure. So I just have a couple more. I don't want to keep you too long. As I said, I got a couple more here. The second last one I have is: do what you can in those moments to once again find compassion for the people who wronged you. Difficult. We all leave our childhood with some scars, and that's okay. That's not our parents' fault. They did the best they could with the tools and trainings that they had. You have to forge ahead without blaming people and without becoming a victim. Don't judge yourself, and don't judge the people around you. Simply cultivate understanding. Awareness and compassion bring you back to a place where you can remember who you are and how you got there. With a healthy perspective, you can make conscious choices about how to move forward. It says a lot there, doesn't it? And it's difficult to think about having compassion for people who wronged you, to accept that childhood is going to have scars, and that's okay, that it's not your parents' fault, that they did the best that they could, that you shouldn't blame people, and that you can't be a victim because it's not going to be helpful, not to judge yourself, not to judge others. All of this is a very difficult for some people, and I sometimes have difficulty with this still myself. And I really, really love this paragraph, though, to just consider this, to reflect on it, to think about it, because it will really help move forward. It will really help you grow and have more compassion, have more awareness, self-awareness, to treat yourself and others better. I think this is a really excellent paragraph. So I wanted to just share that with you. So let me get to my last one so I can let you go. And this one, shorter, but very important as well. Very, very good. What I liked here. When you're choosing who you want to be, you're not a victim of your circumstances anymore. So I think that's a nice one to end on. When you're choosing who you want to be, you're not a victim of your circumstances anymore. So I'd like to leave you with that this evening. Thanks for joining in again. Thanks to those of you who are watching the recording. Always reach out with questions or any comments you have. I appreciate you spending the time with me. I really, really like this book that Josh and Ken have written for us. And again, when you choose who you want to be, you're not a victim of your circumstances anymore. What a great thing to end with. So have a good evening. I'll see you again next Wednesday. Please tell anyone that you know who might benefit from digging into this book, that we're doing this Facebook Live broadcast, and I think it could benefit many people, this book. So thanks again for staying with me with this Struggle Well read along, and have a good week. Cheers. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.